Good morning. So dads, you're life changers, as you know. Those of you that are first-time dads, second-generation dads that we call grandfathers, make such a huge difference. And it may be Father's Day, but the same is true for all the moms in here, every single one. And, you know, our work isn't done. You may have done an outstanding job. You may have made a lot of mistakes that a lot of parents do. But until they put you in the grave, you can still exert your influence and with your children and grandchildren, other people's children. And we have a huge job, and every soul that loves Jesus makes a difference. And so I'm glad you're here, and happy Father's Day. So we're in 1 John right now. 1 John, where'd that come from? We're in Mark chapter 1 this morning. And it's going to be kind of strange, but what I want to do is just quickly do an overview of most of what Bailey just read, just to make a couple of points that usually catch our attention that we normally see, and then do a deeper dive. We're going to peel a few layers of the onion off and look a little bit deeper. I think there's a lot there. It kind of surprised me as I studied this a little bit 2 years ago and then again recently. So here we go. Jesus had been in a place called Capernaum, and that's where Peter lived with his mother-in-law. Don't know how many were in the town. Josephus, and I don't know how much to believe this guy. He lived in the first century, but he said there were 240 towns in Galilee, and most of them had 15,000 people or more. I don't know if that tells us how big Capernaum was or not. But when it says, when Peter and everybody's looking for him, and whoops, where are we here? Did I go too far? It's all right. I decided not to use all the verses. But when Peter says everyone is looking for you around verse 38, 39, who was he talking about? All 12 apostles? Or was he talking about the whole town? Because the whole town had heard of his casting out demons and his healing, and they all surrounded Simon Peter's house to see the healings or to be healed. When he says everybody, he means the entire town have been looking for Jesus, because he took off early in the morning, unannounced, to pray. So here we are, and they finally found him, and so I guess he walks back towards town, and a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him. So I'm going to talk about leprosy twice today. But just a precursor for now. We have at least 3 medical professionals in here, so you're bound to know more than I do. But in reading about leprosy, and I've read about it many times, it's a disease. There's more than one kind. But typically, it ruins your nerves so that you can't feel pain. And pain sounds funny, but pain is a gift from God. So if there's a pebble in your shoe, you feel the pain, you take the pebble out before it causes bruising and cutting and does damage. And so lepers can't feel that. And so they have a lot of self-inflicted injuries. It is a disease, more than one kind, like I said, but it can change the skin of your face. And but when you have this disease, usually you cause some self-inflicted injuries. Maybe you feel an itch. You still, I guess, have some feeling, but you feel an itch and not realizing how hard you're pressing because you've lost your sense of pain. You can open a wound on your leg or your arm or your face, and then what moves in after that, since they have open wounds that come with the disease, infection comes in. And makes your life miserable. And not only that, but from what my reading, if you have leprosy, you're more susceptible to other diseases. And so this is a disease that is hideous to look at, and it made people outcast. And if you read Leviticus 13:14, talks about leprosy. And they were, it's contagious, most kinds are. And so a person with leprosy was not allowed into the camp when they were in the wilderness or into town. They had to live outside the camp. And it was bad, and we'll talk more about it, but just a horrible disease that people feared. So here's a guy, he's a leper, but in Luke 5, around, if I remember correctly, 12 and 13, somewhere in there, it gives the same episode. So does Matthew. 3 times this event is recorded. But in Luke, it says 2 things that we don't read in Mark. It gives more detail. It says he was covered with leprosy. This wasn't just his right foot or his left arm. This guy was in a serious stage, and it killed people. And so he was covered in it. And in Mark, it says that he fell on his knees, falling on his knees, but he didn't stop there. In Luke 5, it goes on to say, then he fell on his face. He was desperate, hopeless. This was a disease that took almost everybody's life, and he's just pleading, humbling himself in desperation, telling Jesus, because he's heard about it. He acknowledges that Jesus says, you can make me clean if you're willing. And Jesus said he's willing. Immediately leprosy left him and he was cleansed. That's a miracle. We know people that have overcome pretty serious cancer. And that's the hand of God. We prayed, and even here in this congregation, there was a lady several years ago, don't remember, 10 or 20, that had cancer, and she went into remission when they didn't expect her to live another week. And so anyway, when something is cured over time, that's the goodness of God. All good things come from God, and especially when we're praying about it. That is what I call providence, the hand of God. But a miracle, instantaneous. No healing time. Jesus said, be healed, or put his hand on them, or the apostles. It was instantaneous. So this man, who'd been suffering for a long time if he was covered with leprosy, was healed instantaneous. Then notice the 3 commands right here. Number 1, before Jesus gives the commands, he sternly warns this guy. Now, I read the Greek too. What does that mean? He means it's a strong insistence. I mean, it is in your face. Don't you dare. And he is warning this man not to 3 things. Some are not to do and some are to do. He says, say nothing to anyone. Nobody. Except show yourself to the priest. Obviously, he's going to have to tell the priest, I had leprosy. I don't now. You had to be declared clean by a priest of God. And so he was to say nothing to anybody. He was to go to the priest, say, inspect me, please declare me clean, and offer for your cleansing. What this means is, if you read again Leviticus 13:14, when a person was made clean from leprosy, because it did happen sometimes, or sometimes it may not have been leprosy, but they weren't sure. They would go to the priest, and the priest would look and say, it's scabbing over, it looks good, you're clean. And then they were to make sacrifices. They were to sacrifice 2 lambs if they had the money. If they were poor, then they got to substitute 1 lamb and a couple of birds. But anyway, so 3 commands. Say nothing, don't talk to anybody about it. Show yourself to the priest, which was in Jerusalem. There in Capernaum. Depending on the route, 85 to 110 miles away. That's a 6-day walk if you really push it. One direction. Round trip, 12 days pushing it. He says that's where you had to make the offering, was in the temple area right there. So that's kind of a background right there, a quick overview. But this guy's in bad shape. Don't tell anybody. Look at the last verse. Curious. But he, the healed man, went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the news around to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him, to Jesus, from everywhere. So remember, 3 commands. Don't talk to anybody. Show yourself to the priest and make an offering. That was the command. This word right here means he didn't do it. But he went out and began. So as soon as he went out, he began to proclaim Jesus' miracle freely. Didn't do it. This perplexed me for years. We studied Mark, and I think I got it part right 2 years ago, working on it. But this issue perplexed me, and what perplexed me was this. Why would Jesus tell him not to tell anybody? That's not the biggest point here that we're going to see today. There's a bigger one, more important for every one of us. But that's the one I stuck with. Oh, I get it now. Now I know why Jesus told him not to tell anybody. It's valid, it's important. There's something bigger. So that's what perplexed me. And so we talked about meditation for a couple of weeks. That's helped me a lot. I just broke this down, chewed on it word for word, and think there's a lot in here for you and me. So we're going to call this sermon, Why, Lord? Or When We Don't Understand. We're going to limit to what we don't understand, because there's a lot of what we... But why, Lord? That's the idea of it. The main points are going to be this. The message of Mark 1, 40, 45. When you understand a command, but not the purpose, you understand the command. Oh, I get it. You want me to do something, but you don't understand the why. What do? Do we need to understand the purpose of a command before we obey it? And sometimes our Heavenly Father chooses not to explain the purpose for his commands. So that's going to be the main points we're looking at today. Very apropos for all of us here. So now a little bit deeper dive. I think we need to explore. So you understand that he's elated. This guy is cured. He's elated. He goes out and tells everybody. But to understand the extent of his joy, we really need to understand the horror of leprosy. I mean, the more I thought about it and put myself there and said, well, if this is true, then what would be the ramifications? I'm not going to get gross, but we need to understand the horror of leprosy to understand why this guy broke all 3 of Jesus' commands and disobeyed Jesus. So he disobeyed the Messiah, the Son of God, 3 times. And so no big deal, right? I mean, happy ending. It ended on a good note, no harm, no foul, right? He's praising Jesus. That's good, isn't it? He's not praising a human being or a false god, but the Son of God. All good, isn't it? You might think so, and maybe I thought so for years when I just kind of looked at it and said, I wonder if that means, and moved on. But if we read about Jesus, we know that he probably performed in the millions, but at least a few 100,000 miracles, because everybody, you said in class today there were 2,000 Jews in Pentecost during that time when they would come together. Well, there were several million in the whole area, and we read in other places in the Gospels that everybody came to him from both sides of the Jordan River, even from Gentile lands. People came to see Jesus to be healed. So a few 100,000 safely healings. And only a very few, I mean, not even 1%, just a fraction of the miracles he did were recorded. Why this one? All Scripture is inspired by God and profitable. 2 Timothy 3, 2 Timothy 2:15. Why this one? not others that weren't written down. I think we can draw the conclusion, you make up your own mind, that the one who was healed that you think would be grateful, and maybe he was in an emotional way, he dishonored and disrespected Jesus by doing just the opposite of what he told him to do. And secondly, I think the reason this is recorded, because it looks okay, kind of, right? Okay, well, he didn't do exactly what Jesus said, but look, he's proclaiming Jesus. And we're going to see that great harm was done. Great harm. This isn't insignificant. This is not meaningless. But many were hurt by what this man did. So that's what we're going to look at today. So our lesson, as I said, is called Why, Lord? Or what should we do when we understand the command of God, but we don't understand the purpose of the command? What should we do? That's where we're headed now. So anyway, the horror of leprosy, if I may. It was a slow death. You didn't die in a week, a month. There have been leper colonies, even now in the world. I guess, I forget her name, the lady in India, the nun. I can't remember it. But Mother Teresa. Thank you. But the length of life varies from individual to individual, like it is in everything else. But here's the deal. One of the worst things about it was the constant loneliness. You were told in Leviticus 13:14, live alone. You have to live. You can't live in the camp. You have to go outside the camp. Lonely and no human touch. I mean, I hug my granddaughter Ari, maybe too much. And maybe that's why she hugs and kisses her baby sister a lot too. But there's something about the human touch. You know, you make endorphins, positive ones, oxytocin for one, when you shake hands or you hug someone, and they had none of that. And I've talked to people that were lonely. Maybe they went through a divorce, and for a while they went without human touch, and they've told me how terrible that is. Well, these lepers, they were, pushed off as worthless. In fact, some Jews were cruel to them because they assumed, and if you read John 9, you'll see it there, but and even among Jesus' apostles, but many Jews, maybe the majority, like Job's friends, assumed that when you suffered for one reason, because you were a bad sinner. The greater you suffered, the worse sinner you were. So when they saw a blind person, who sinned? This man? No, this man's parents? Or this man before he was born? Who sinned? Because he was born blind. You can imagine with that kind of social outcastism, how ostracized, how lonely, how rejected they felt, and they did. So maybe this is the worst of all, I don't know. But they weren't allowed to be with their family. They had to live alone, for one. And maybe, and I tried to get information, some of it just, no one recorded it, but I'm assuming for those that loved their dad who had leprosy, or their mom, that the kids or relatives would get together and stay at a distance. It was law. But stay at a distance and say, hey, Obadiah, we brought you some food and a new cloak. And maybe they would leave it there and then maybe have a conversation. And so maybe the kids would say, told myself not to get choked up, but these are real people and real lives. So the kids see the dad. I love you, Daddy. I miss you. Wouldn't that tear your heart out? And of course, as a dad or mom, you're going to miss them too. You couldn't hug your wife. You couldn't worship with them or any of the Jews, maybe with the other lepers, but you couldn't go to a synagogue and enjoy the fellowship of God's people. You couldn't work. How does a leper buy food to eat or a new pair of sandals, used pair of sandals, when theirs wear out? Where do they get the money? They can't work. No one's going to hire them. It's against God's law. How do they provide for their family? And so the emotional pain was probably the worst thing at all. And then, to make matters worse, in Leviticus 13:45, if people were around them, whether they were outside the city or wherever they were, they had to call out, they had to cry out, "Unclean! Unclean! Filthy, filthy, dirty, unacceptable, repulsive, unclean!" I just think it's so easy as Americans. And when I got COVID, I run to my doctor and it's gone in 3 days twice. And not saying they cured, I'm just saying that they supported my immune system. No cure. No cure. Prayer for a few. Unclean. Just a horrible thing. So you can imagine now when Jesus says, "I'm willing," and he touches him and he heals him completely. After going through the horror, maybe for a few years, he's overwhelmed with joy. It's immeasurable joy. It's jubilation, elation. He can't believe it. And he's telling everybody. So you can maybe see part of the reason why he couldn't reword that. Why he didn't hold back. He could have held back. Jesus told him, "Tell no one, show yourself to the priest, make an offering." And he disobeyed all three of those. So one more thing. He might say, well, maybe he didn't understand Jesus. Well, first of all, the stern warning means that he's making it absolutely really clear what the guy should do and what he shouldn't do. And you know this, but put it in perspective. I don't think about these things sometimes unless I'm really digging into it. Who created language? God did. Jesus did. He created all things. Colossians 1, John 1. He created language. He's the master communicator, and he's able to get his message across where people understood it. And if the man didn't understand it, Jesus can read hearts and minds, and he can say, repeat to me what I just said. I mean, he knows. And he says, here's what I want you to do and not to do. And the guy understood. He chose not to obey. This is a really big point in this passage right here. I think we'll find out as we move on. He understood all three of the commands. But, as I pointed out, he went out and did just the opposite. Did the healed man do any damage? That is the question on the table right now. Well, one of the questions is this. Well, the answer is yes, he did. But what was Jesus' main goal? What was Jesus' main goal on earth, right? Okay, to seek and save that which is lost. Luke chapter 19. Or in, what do I have up here? I have Matthew 1:21, second half B. The angel telling Mary about her coming son. He, Jesus, will save his people from the sin. That's his message. That's his message. And to do so, he had to do two main things. Number one, look at what he says in this same chapter in verse 38 that was read by Bailey. Mark 1:38, his apostles find him, and he says to them, let's go somewhere else to towns nearby so that I may preach there also, for that is what I came for. Two steps. Jesus came to preach, and he says so. That was his mission. And then to die for anyone, for everyone, especially those that calling him as Lord. Preach and sacrifice himself. That was his mission. Miracles were not. Miracles were awesome. They supported the preaching, but miracles, what they did is they confirmed that the person who's doing the miracle was from God. Because human beings can't do miracles. We can't break the laws of nature. So when a man would heal the dead person like Jesus did or Peter did, no one can do that except God. This guy is working for God. I want to hear his message. And that was the purpose of miracles, not to temporarily forestall death. Everybody that Jesus healed died. All of them. As we will. That was not his main concern. He cares about people, listens to the prayer. His main mission was not to do miracles. It was to preach the gospel and die for our sin. And so that man messed this up. In Mark 1:45, we've read it a couple times already. He began to proclaim it so freely, to spread the news around to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city. Well, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? Well, if you got 15,000 people in the average city in Galilee, how are the really elderly people going to go out in the wilderness? How are they going to walk 2 to 5 miles? How are the disabled that need the miracle, how are they going to get out there 2 to 5 miles one way and then back? Well, when they come back, maybe they're healed, but it wasn't that they wouldn't be healed physically. It was that they wouldn't be healed spiritually. They wouldn't hear Jesus' message. If they were lame, if they were blind, if they were elderly, he hurt a lot of people, because now those in town that might have been able to walk a few blocks, some of them couldn't get to Jesus. Great damage. There's a reason why there's a reason behind every command, even if we don't understand what it is. Tell nobody, because he knew this would happen, and it hurt the preaching of the gospel. And Jesus is infallible, doesn't make mistakes, and he said, don't tell anybody. Okay, so what do we do? What do we do when we hear a command and we understand it, but we don't understand its purpose? What do we do then? I hear the command. What do we do when we hear the command, we understand the command, but we don't like the command? We disagree with the command. We think we have a better way to do it than God does. What do we do? And I know it's mixed. I can look at my own life and say, mixed. The right way sometimes, the wrong way sometimes. But I have a friend, not a close friend, but very God-fearing man. Always involved in this church that he's in Federal Way. And they came up to him, same name as me, and they said, Mike, we want you to serve. We're starting a new church, and we want you to be an elder. And he said, he's never been married. And he said, don't I have to be married to serve as an elder and have children? He asked the question. Come on. Anybody have the little turn? Oh, here it is right here. It is not working for me right now, and I'm not sure which way to move this. Okay, let's try one more thing. Let's try the keyboard, and if not, then I'm going to have some techie guy help me out here. Aha! Don't I need to be married, he said. Notice the verse, why he asked the question. He was pretty much raised by this church. He's about my age now. And here's what the scriptures say. For this reason, I left you in Crete, Paul, writing to Titus, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe. So you got to be a husband. You got to have children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. Now, They claim to be a church that follows the Bible. Guy had a radio program, don't know if he still does or not. Yeah, we follow the Bible. He says, well, don't I need to be married, have kids? No, you're qualified. No explanation, just you're qualified. That is exactly what this healed man did. He knows the command. He chooses to go another direction. Maybe they don't like this command that you have to be a male, or you have to be a husband, or you have to have believing children. I don't know. I didn't talk to any of these people, but I'm painting a picture here that is common. And I love those opportunities when I get to talk to people, because I say, hey, can we chew on this a little bit? It opens up. God wants them to be saved too. So there are churches that if they don't like it, or they don't agree with it, or they think they have a better idea, but you're qualified and we think you could be a great elder. Well, God doesn't. And so he became one. So here's another one more on a personal level. Talking to all Christians, we're to bear with one another, forgiving each other, whoever has a complaint against anyone. So notice this is whoever against anyone. Just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. So if whoever has a complaint against anyone, that means there are no exceptions. That means you've been wounded. Who hasn't? I don't mean that lightly. I'm saying that if you're a human being, you've been painfully wounded by another human being multiple times, most likely. And you're not to harbor ill will. You're human. You can't necessarily forget what they did. But you're not to hang on to it and cling to it and let it fester and develop the root of bitterness in your heart that Hebrews 12, I think it's 15, talks about. So yeah, but they don't deserve it. Now when we have that kind of response, we understand the command, everyone is to forgive everyone, but I don't like it, or I have a better idea, or I'm a judge and they don't deserve forgiveness. Just so easy to do. How about this one? Guilty. I really try not to, but driving late to teach a Bible class or preach a sermon. And they go, Bible says in Romans 13 to obey. Do I have it down here for you? I do, and I don't see it. No, there it is right there. Every person to be in subjection to governing authorities. That means the laws we're under, unless they break the law of God. For there's no authority except from God. And those authorities which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation on themselves. So here I am driving, I go, Lord, what's more important? I mean, I need to be there on time. And maybe it's a class with someone that's not a Christian yet. And, my mind is working on, is there any workaround on this going 60 miles an hour? And maybe 65 is okay. We've talked about this 3 years ago. Maybe because it's in a former policeman, but maybe if it's not enforced until you're going 5 miles an hour, 7 miles an hour, or 10 miles an hour, maybe that's really the law. That's not the issue. What's at hand is this. We feel the need to break a law of God for personal reasons. We know what it says. We may not know why it says it. I had a Christian friend who 3 sermons he preached on, it's okay to speed. It's okay to break the law. The government is under your control. It should be in subjection to you. But let's don't worry about him. The question is, do you do this? You say, I'll obey that, but this one I just don't like. Forgiveness or obeying the speed limit. I don't like that one. What do you do then? Because there's commandments that I would assume that everybody doesn't like. So just trying to paint a picture here that what do you do when you understand a command, but you don't understand the purpose, or you don't like the purpose, or you disagree with it, or you think you have a better idea. Okay, number 3 point. Do we need to understand the purpose of a command before we obey? Well, in Genesis 22:1, I'm just going to paraphrase it. God tells Abraham, who waited 25 years to have his son through his wife, Sarah. 25 years. They finally, when he's 100 years old, she's with child, and the promises are made through Isaac. And when he's 12 years old, God then says, Abraham, take your child, your only son, and sacrifice him to me. And he doesn't tell Abraham why. Doesn't tell him why. What do you do then? They had longed for a son. And it says that we're told why, that God tested Abraham. Didn't tell Abraham that. Just sacrifice your son. That would have been tough. That would have been tough if he had 10 children, 10 daughters and sons. Abraham started to do so, and the angel stopped him. God wanted to see, do you trust me? And God had seen. Abraham had failed God more than once, but he saw God is always there, trustworthy. I will obey him. God considered him his friend because Abraham obeyed. And so he probably thought, that doesn't make sense to me. You told me through him the promises of all the nations be blessed, and then to kill him before he has any children. But he obeyed. Tough to do. But that's what God is looking for. If you understand the purpose, then obey. If you understand the command, obey. And so if you don't understand a command, then you can't keep it, right? Like, here's an example. Make plastic ice alphabetically by smashing goldfish crackers with a hammer. Nonsense. You can't obey something, but God doesn't give nonsense. When we understand it, whether we know or like the purpose, that's when we're to take action. So he wants us to obey whether we understand the purpose or not. Abraham did think this through. Hebrews 11:19 says he considered, when he was told to sacrifice Isaac, it says he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, because he knew God would keep his promise. Promised blessing through Isaac, and they hadn't come about yet. All right. We don't have this kind of standard for our children. We don't do this. We don't say, you must always ask before you borrow the car. You must always ask. But if you don't understand the command, then borrow it anytime you want. We don't do that. I don't want you making campfires in your bedroom. That's the command. But if you don't understand the command, go ahead. No big deal. No. We have the same standard for our children, or close, that God does. In military, some of you have been in the military, me too, and you obey the commands. And sometimes there's not this life or death, and they don't even have time to explain the purpose of the command. Grab that gas can now, jump in the Jeep, and let's take off. Why? I don't know. No, you do what your superiors tell you to do. Same with God, but even more so. Every command in the New Testament, we do know this purpose is designed, is given to bless us. Every command in the New Testament is given to bless us. 1 Timothy 4:1, for everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with gratitude. So God created all the commandments, and everything he creates is good, and they're all based, I don't think we'll review it because of time, but every commandment, as you remember from 2 weeks ago, is based upon the foundation of agape, on foundation of love. Jesus said that all the law and all the prophets depend upon loving God and loving your neighbor. And since God is love, motivated to love us, All his commandments are based upon that, Jesus says, on love. So they're going to bless us. Disobeying, on the other hand, always does damage. Always. If it's good, if a commandment is for our good and we don't obey it, then we miss out. But probably more than that. There's probably usually some negative consequences. Last main point. You know this, but sometimes the Heavenly Father just chooses not to explain. Abraham, sacrifice your son Isaac. No explanation. How about this one? The Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to a land which I will show you. Whoa! It's a dangerous place out there. Lots of bad people out there, lots of bad countries. And he says, you start traveling, I'll show you where to go. Right? And so he says to Sarah, listen, you're so beautiful. They're going to kill you. Kill me. You're going to kill me to get you. And we need to go. There's a famine. We need to go to Egypt and to lie. No, they didn't need to lie. God would keep his promise. But Abraham thought they did. He wasn't completely trusting God yet. He didn't understand why. But he obeyed. He did obey and left his family. There's just one example. Colossians 3:19. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. It doesn't tell us why. She says, do it. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing. Lord, that one does tell a why. It makes God happy. Fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. There's a why. And if you're a Bible student, I understand that you're probably thinking of Ephesians 5, where it does tell husbands why they should love their wives. And you're right. But the Ephesians got the letter first. The Colossians got Colossians, and they didn't get an explanation in their letter as to why the husbands should love their wives. So not everything is spelled out for us. Everything in my lesson, I thought it'd be short this time. Sorry about that. But everything in my lesson focused on really one central idea. Well, one is that obey. You don't have to understand. Just you need to know who God is. And if he's real, and if the Bible is his inspired word, you're in good shape. Obey. You don't have to understand. But I like this one. 2 Corinthians 5:7. For we, Christians, walk by faith and not by sight. Faith is almost identical to trust. We walk by trust. We trust God. We read his word. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. We trust him. We have faith in him, and we walk by that trust and not by sight. Sight, walking by sight, is knowing the answers ahead of time. I know what the situation, I know what the consequences will be here, but if I do what God tells me, I'm not sure what the consequences will be, and we do it anyway. That's walking by faith. That's walking by trust when we don't know. Of course, we don't know anything for sure, but even if we don't understand the purpose of a command, if we understand the command, then he'd like us. He wants us. He commands us to obey the command. And it's not always easy. If you've been a Christian or you're not one, it's not always easy. And it's not always pleasant to obey the commands of God. But they're always for our benefit. And that's walking by faith. Thank you so much. That'll end our lesson for today. This time we're going to have a song of invitation. So if you have any spiritual needs, please come forward. We'll be standing and sing the song of invitation. Oops, we go too far.